This is a panel for Rohini Mohan's triumphant work of investigative journalism, The Seasons of Trouble. I'm the creative director of Verso Books. I'm also an adjunct faculty at the New School University in the Creative Publishing Master's Program, along with Jim Miller here, and the founder and publisher of The New Inquiry. And I want to talk a little bit about the process of working on this book from the perspective of the creative director at Verso and the reception it's been getting, and then send it to Rohini to explain a little bit more about what the book covers. This is a book that sort of has no business existing in the current publishing landscape. It's by an unknown young woman of color that's not based in the United States. It's about the Sri Lankan Civil War, which very few people care about or even know about. It's long, and there's nothing to peg it to coverage or popular interest, and yet it's one of the more urgent, morally urgent and relevant books that I've encountered in recent years, and in the process of trying to get coverage for it and trying to get people to read it, I've seen people, kind of become ignited by this book. They've become political about what's happening in Sri Lanka. In fact, just coincidentally, it was a 5-year process for Rohini to write this, but it is being released in a moment when the UN is finally investigating the Sri Lankan state for war crimes against the Tamil people. So in that sense, this is a very timely book to come out, but it targets human lives and tells the story of Sri Lanka from within the personal narratives of people who survived the war, in particular, certain Tamil characters. And now it's a book that I'm glad you're all here to learn about in the first wave. It's getting a lot of ground support. Just today it was listed as NPR's one of the top books of 2014. It's been listed by Slate as the most overlooked book of the year. And it's getting the groundswell that it deserves for a first-time writer, Rohini Mohan, who has done something extraordinary with the process of investigative journalism. And so, without further ado, I assume you know there's a write-up there of everyone's bio, so I'm not going to read it. Very important people are here. But I want to send it to Rohini to just tell you all who haven't read it about the process of writing the book and about who the book is about and why you tell it through the lives of these specific people.
Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me okay? I'm a journalist in India, and the first time I went to Sri Lanka was in 2009. That was the year the Civil War, which was 30 years long, about 30 years long. That's how long it lasted, and that was the year it ended. And I went there not knowing very much about Sri Lanka, but speaking one of the languages. And going there there was a question in my mind about other conflicts and what happens when an ethnic conflict ends, and how people come out of it after living through almost their entire lives, living through a civil war, living through the kind of violence that it brings to your everyday life. That was the question. And so over 5 years, while I had a full-time job in India as a journalist covering other issues, I would go as often as possible to Sri Lanka, and there I met several people. As any journalist would, you meet anyone who can give you some perspective on the issue. So I met an array of people, from activists, journalists, people in government, people who were former militants, those who were hiding militants, an array of people. And finally, and I kept going back to these same people. It was organic. Sometimes it was a decision to ask some people some more questions and find out whether they would respond differently at a different point in their life. So that was the way for me to enter the conflict that until then I had only vaguely understood and known about. The three people that I finally chose to write about are kind of I would say I decided on the three of them over a process of, there were about 8 people that I actually interviewed in depth, and of them, these 3 people kind of survived the negotiation of trust, and also some of the corroborations and verifications of some of the claims that they made. Some of their stories survived that. Some haven't, and they still are in the book. I try to put as much doubt as I can in some of their claims, while at the same time, some of the other claims that they made, some of the stories they said, I thought were powerful and also very important and significant for that particular context, but also something that I believe resonates for people who live through conflict or people who want to understand conflict in other parts of the world. The 3 people are one, I call her Mugil in the book, her name is changed. She was a former combatant. She was a child soldier with the Tamil Tigers. That was a separatist group that wanted a Tamil homeland, and it started in the 80s. When I met her, she was the mother of 2 children, and I tracked her through 5 years. And through her, I tried to show something about her community and specifically her life and how it was to live under the militancy, and also her interactions with the state. The other person is Sarva, whose name I've retained, that's his real name. He was picked off the street in Colombo, which is the capital of Sri Lanka, which was not where the war was going on. And he disappeared, and for the next 4 years, it wasn't clear what was happening to him. Eventually, I found that he was tortured, and then he had to leave the country, and he now lives in the UK. The other person is his mother. Her name is Indra in the book, and she was trying to get him out. In those 4 years when I could not, it was 2 years when I could not meet him, she was meeting him in prison after 2 years of searching for him and trying to just get him out. So she is the middle-aged person, while the other 2 are around 30 years old, which is how long the war was. So she presents a perspective of not having chosen the war, but feeling its effects. So these are the 3 people I wrote about. And the book I try in the book through these 3 people to save some more stories, but also constantly try to save their stories as complexly, with as much complexity as they gave it when they told me.
So, thank you. I'd like to send it over to Siddhartha, specifically about his work, The Beautiful and the Damned, which also deals with talking about a political, cultural, and historical moment through other people's lives, and why that is the medium of narrative that he chose.
Thanks, Rachel. So, I think what I want to do is, it might seem to you that this story, for some of you, or many of you, that the story is set very far away. Although I recognize some familiar faces who do know the Civil War in Sri Lanka. But I actually, I wanted to talk about truth and writing about others by starting here. And I've been listening a lot to Gil Scott-Heron lately. Some of you might be able to guess why. I've been listening to a song. Today I was listening to the song, Who'll Pay Reparations for My Soul? And there's some lovely lines in there, which goes, many suggestions and documents written, many directions for the end that was given. They gave us pieces of silver and pieces of gold. Tell me who'll pay reparations on my soul. So, I think there's a lot of writing that exists, a lot of it of the first kind, that are just documents. They don't have anything to do with the soul. They're just pieces of gold or pieces of silver. They don't really address the difficult questions of our times, even when they seem to. And so, I think one of the things that when you're talking about writing about others, talking about storytelling, there's a kind of incredible violence that we live in, which is always there, and I think of it as a kind of violence of neoliberalism, but you can find other names for it. That sometimes seems to move into a higher gear when it becomes more visible, more obvious, like right now in Ferguson or right now in Mexico. But what I want to say is, if you stretch the lines in time and space, you'll see that that kind of violence is ongoing, and that's what takes you to Sri Lanka, that's what takes you to India, that's what takes you to other places. These are not discontinuous things. These are, in some sense, part of our ongoing contemporary struggles. So how does my book deal with that? You know, my work is mostly with India. It's, in fact, my work is entirely about India. I say mostly, but if I think about it, it's almost entirely about India. And it's in the form of this long, ongoing quarrel with the idea of India, with what the violence that it involves, with the violence of, you know, which is a quarrel that's become even more pronounced now that India has a right-wing Hindu majority and sectarian government backed by a jingoistic middle class, very much like the Siddhartha government in Sri Lanka. That, you know, so, you know, it's interesting to see these continuities across. So my work is about that, and in some sense it's about this ongoing quarrel. What does that have to do with fiction? What does that have to do with nonfiction and writing about others? Well, you know, there's this lovely W.B. Yeats quote, which says that, you know, out of our quarrel with others we write rhetoric, and out of the quarrel with ourselves we make poetry. And for me, that's a kind of false division, in the sense that when you're writing about others, we're actually also writing about ourselves. And that's the kind of nonfiction writing that I find most provocative, that I find most interesting, that I try to do myself. When I'm writing nonfiction, I'm not blanking myself out from the narrative, not because I'm important, but because I'm also a character, because just as by choosing to tell stories, I'm also a part of the world that I'm writing about. So in my case, in my nonfiction book, you know, I try to write about people who are powerful and people who are powerless. And in both cases, it takes nuance, it takes empathy, very different results. In my book, the first chapter is about a very wealthy man, and I thought I portrayed with a great deal of nuance, but he did manage to get a court case against the book before the book came out, so the book appears in India without the first chapter. So, you know, that's a kind of relationship with the writing, with another, you know, you can see him, I think, on television last year saying, you know, I will get this man arrested, we'll put him in jail, or when he comes to, you know, so that's one kind of relationship. But, you know, it is involved, and there's a part of myself that, you know, even though this man is wealthy, a man on the make, there's a part of me that identifies with him, empathizes with him, actually. I think you can't actually write about people without actually empathizing with them, so at some degree. So, you know, that's one kind of person I've written about in nonfiction, and then the other kind, my last chapter, which I'm more proud of, is completely the reverse. The first man is very wealthy, public figure, one of the most visible faces in India. I wrote about him, he sued me. The last one is about a young woman who was a waitress at the time. And, you know, she's the kind of invisible sort of multitude. And I wanted to give her character. I wanted to give her as much. She had character, but I wanted to capture it as a writer. And I did. And, you know, I just saw today that I did use a real name because she wanted her privacy to be protected. And I just noticed today that she clicked on a link of mine on Facebook. So I went and looked at her photographs and, you know, how she's changed over the years. So there's a kind of relationship there, which is kind of interesting too. And I think writing is about relationships. I think when you're writing about others, it's about relationships. I think there's very often a kind of a division here between memoir and immersion journalism, which is also a class division, which is also a kind of north-south division. And I'm interested in the kind of writing that challenges that breaks down. Because I think self and other is formed by intersection with each other. So that's the kind of nonfiction. That's what I think writing about others is about. But if you want to do it with complexity and nuance, it's about writing about the soul. To go back to the Gil Scott Heron quote that I started with. Jim.
Well, listening to you, I realized I came toward, in the writing that I've done that's nonfiction, which is it's entirely rooted in telling the stories of actual individuals. But my training was as a historian, and I came out of the crucible of 60s leftism, and I wrote a dissertation that was on existential Marxism. And I look back and I realized I was very influenced by an idea and being the nothingness that If you want to understand concretely injustice in the world, you have to undertake what amounts to an existential psychoanalysis, this is Sartre's term, and look at single individuals as they're intersected by historical forces beyond their control, and how those forces flow through their projects and inhibit or deform them, and yet people continue to struggle to be free and make something out of what they've been made. My first attempt at nonfiction with a narrative arc was a book published 25 years ago called Democracies in the Streets, which is a book about the student activists of the 60s who had gathered at a UAW camp in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan to draft something called the Port Huron Statement, which called for participatory democracy, which is a term that's still used today, was used in Zuccotti Park recently as an ideal. And I have to say that I chose, by then I'd become committed to looking concretely at specific people for a different reason than the one you've given. And it's a political reason. It's that by looking at people and how they actually behaved, you could bring out the ambiguities, the contradictions, the conflict between pure intentions and mendacious motives that, when you look closely at most political actors, is what you're going to find. And I had a problem in my book. One of my characters is Tom Hayden, and I discovered actually I had very clear evidence that at the height of the Chicago Democratic Convention of 1968, he had tried to incite a riot. The police never had this evidence. If they had, he might have been convicted in the trial of the Chicago 7. I sent him a copy of what I'd written, and he denied that any such thing had happened, and then I named the names of his Confederates. Tom is a decent enough person that actually it led to another round of interviews in which he came out of the closet about what had really happened. And what had really happened was he had been driven mad by police surveillance, which was in part a deliberate goal of trailing him. And he was in a kind of folie à deux with the police in 1968. He was running around wearing masks. He was not making sound and good judgments. He was saying bad things to people to try to get them to do bad things, and when he stepped back from it, he had to acknowledge that had been the case. Now, I actually think that knowing those kinds of contradictions makes history and politics, well, first of all, it makes history more accurate, but it makes the actual stakes of political activism a lot more real. And I have to say that this book, The Seasons of Trouble, is, I think, in many ways an extraordinary achievement because of the fact that the author has been able to get into her main characters and deliver them with a wholeness that changes over the course of the pages of the book, because they become different people in the year after year they're processing what it's like to live as defeated Tamils in Sri Lanka, for those who are still there. And she is able to do this in a way that inspires in a reader, or at least me, an incredible amount of trust in the story she's telling. And this is important because, given the political circumstances in Sri Lanka, if she, a historian could not accept this book as any kind of evidence, because one of, I think, the most marvelous character, Mughal, the name has been changed, and the sources are not always given. To give actual names and sources would put people's lives at risk. It's that kind of stakes in what has been done. But I trust this narrator because of her meticulous attention to detail, to complexities, to contradictions, to the factual context. At crucial moments, she draws out and she gives you enough of the history of what was a complicated ethnic civil war to keep your feet on the ground, but also because of her, quote, even perspective. This is her phrase, even perspective. We've in our class had a lot of people talking and scorning the notion of objectivity in journalism. This isn't what she's saying about. She's not claiming objectivity and evenness of perspective. And it's an evenness that extends to, at moments, frank accounts of the prejudices and the blindness of her otherwise sympathetically rendered protagonists. And to me, two things flow from this. The first is, to speak colloquially, that the story has the ring of truth to me. Secondly, I perceive these characters as human, all too human, and incredibly three-dimensional. And that leads me to an observation about the book, which is, I'm going to make an observation, actually it's different than what Rachel has said. Because what floored me about this book, particularly published by Verso, is I don't read it as a political tract. It does not read as didactic. I actually don't know what the views of the author are on the various sides of the Sri Lankan Civil War. And one of the deliberate stylistic decisions she makes, which is rather brave, is that politics all goes into the background. There's 3 pages at the end where you get a potted history of the Civil War. You pick up the pieces as you go along. But I honestly don't know, does she even have a horse in this race? And that leads me to a question that, you can speak for yourself when the time comes, but I'm going to take an old-fashioned approach, and I ask myself at the end, what's the moral of this story? We see these characters suffer, and my favorite character ends up in jail, right? And in the very beginning of the book, this character, Mughal, this is the penultimate line of the introduction. Mughal says her experience is a warning for the next marginalized group that refuses to assimilate. And that reminded me, there are a number of very powerful passages, but one of my favorite passages in the book is midway through. It's kind of incredible scene where the Sri Lankan army is closing in around encircled Tamil population, many of whom have been very active in the Tamil Tigers and are therefore liable to be executed if they're captured. And in a kind of fraught situation, they're by the sea, there are boats available to try to climb into the boats, go to islands and try to get to India. And there's this moment in which Mughal thinks, yeah, I'm going to do this. And there's dissension within the family. Some people think this is an act of traitorship. Mughal, who had been a militant of the first stand with the Tamil Tigers, has by now abjured the mission of the Tigers. She's wrenched off her necklace that identifies her as a militant because she's so disgusted with the which they've forced gang-pressed young children into fighting a kind of last-ditch defense of the Tamil homeland. And she talks about being in touch with a friend who has fled to Germany. And the friend writes, this is the context in which she tells this anecdote, that her friend was very happy in Germany. And the reason is given, she says, quote, "Here I can stop caring about others all the time. I can be happily self-centered." And that vision of fleeing constant political pressure, you have to be on this side or on that side, that's what this book is about. It's like you participate or you die. It's forced political participation. There is no escape. That's what the Civil War did. It was a constant pressure cooker. So what I think is fantastic is you can see at this point this woman thinking, oh, yeah, that seems very attractive. And then she gets guilt-tripped. And the final sentence is, guilt-ridden, she turned back. She comes back. And the guilt is in part because she's being said, how can you be a traitor to your people? It's bad enough that you've left the Tigers, but now this. And it gets to her. And she ends up in jail. The question of what counts as assimilation in that final statement of Mughal, the picture that's given of what assimilation means in this book is so harsh because the Sri Lanka government is basically going to force people to integrate. They will be forced to desegregate. They have lived in separate ethnic enclaves. So now the Tamil homeland, they will bring people in, and they will force Sri Lankans with other beliefs to settle among the Tamil people. It's forced desegregation. So the word assimilation is loaded in this context. And I say it because as I tried to digest what this meant, there are so many mixed feelings raised in this kind of account. But one of them that struck me is the notion of the placid peace of what Rachel called neoliberal society as a great attraction for people who have lived on the doorstep of death for 30 years for absolute totalizing political beliefs.
Thank you for saying all those things. It's just, I'm reeling a bit with it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you, Jim. I mean, one thing I want to kind of have pre-prepared questions, but one thing I want to maybe just get into in the substance of the book right away is that, and this question goes to Rohini and to both Siddhartha and Jim as readers of the book, is where is assimilation placed in this book when, in fact, it appears that indeed what was taking place was genocide. There was not, it wasn't forced assimilation, it was the removal of those that were not already integrated into the dominant society. And Rohini, we had in a conversation recently with Colin McCann, whose documentary has instigated the investigation of the war crimes, McCrae, whose investigation has his documentary sparked the investigation of the UN into war crimes in Sri Lanka, which was, as far as he's depicting in a very propagandistic documentary, although quite convincing even so, that it was in fact genocide. Does that leave you, Rohini, walking away from this story with a sense of stronger politics about what you were doing? Do you feel that the book now, as it's released in the midst of this investigation, has a political role to play?
It was because of people's extreme and very strong, sometimes propagandist, but really many times just actual strong belief in certain things, which were almost sort of really black and white, or wanting to be black and white. It was that actually confounded me in the beginning, that how can you be so sure? And also that even on the same side, there would be 5 different people being really sure about 5 different things and not talking to each other about it. And I started realizing that after years of kind of polarization and all of that, that's what happens, that people are unable to talk to each other because you've all moved into certain very hard positions. So I think genocide was a word that I came to very, it came to me actually very early on when I started the work on the book, and when I was in New York, when the diaspora was talking about calling it the genocide, and this was even before the war had ended. So the first thing that came to my mind was, how can you call it a genocide already? I know that people are dying, and there were numbers out there, with numbers that were refuted by so many different people. Everyone giving a different number, so many times, so many different numbers out there that what might be the real number becomes irrelevant or unimportant. And genocide is, I don't know, there is a whole science or whatever behind calling something a genocide. So I would say calling it a massacre is important, and that was something that that got me into a lot of fights with people here. But I became surer of that position of my. It was almost it's not a position; it's the lack of one, I guess. That when I went to Sri Lanka and people would tell me that they wanted an investigation, that they wanted things to be out there and counted, and all the complexities to be out there, and for solutions not be foisted on them, but for them to be able to choose one. And all of this started making sense to me as almost it just means that you just need to hear these people out in a sense. And even though those who have no stakes in it are the ones I felt were coming to positions much faster. And the assimilation is a different kind of, it's a submission just as genocide tries to be, I guess. It's assimilation, people explained it to me as a loss of identity or a dilution of it, which is something you live through, while genocide is actually elimination, killing. So when both kinds of things are happening, when physical violence and also cultural attacks on identity, silencing, all of that happens together, and so you've lost someone, and then now you're losing your ability to, you're losing the rights to speak up. So it happens together. So that was the kind of aftermath that I was trying to show. That's why I said assimilation. And in the arc of their lives, as Jim pointed out, I say that her life was, she would always talk about it as a warning, and that is why she wanted to tell me the story. That was something that was the responsibility she gave me. And Mogil said that, I see that the next minority group in this country is being attacked, and it reminds me of everything that we went through, and what if they react in the same way that my community did, and then there will be another war. So it was it was apocalyptic. It was scary to listen to her, but that is what I think when people hit back, when people react to calls for assimilation or silencing, there might be some groups which react in ways in which, even from within the responses, even within the community, there may be reactions that actually take them further away from the peace that they seek. And that was kind of what I could tell through someone who chose violence at one point and then was questioning it. Yeah, so I guess the difficulty in all of this was just to be able to say all of this while I have not experienced any of this. To come to it from a life of privilege, and I mean, no one's attacked me. It's maybe the closest I can come to understanding this is as a woman, in that there's some ways in which I'm silenced and I'm controlled and I'm not able to express things that I want to. Or also as sometimes a young person in a room full of old people or whatever, right? So things like that. Or as a journalist among others who consider the as as just trying to get power. So I can put myself in those positions of disadvantage, but that's not very real. I don't have the disadvantages that the people I wrote about had. So the idea was just to show them in their complexity. If they want to call it genocide, I would ask them why. And if they want to say massacre, I mean, there are different words they would use in Tamil or in Sinhala. It's important to ask why, and immediately that opens up that word and opens up what their experiences are.
So I want to open up a question to everyone here on the panel in response to something Siddhartha said, which is, when you're writing about others, you're always writing about yourself. And Jim didn't talk about his own most recent work very much, which I read in preparation for this panel, but it opens with the story of Socrates, and that his life revolved around the imperative to know thyself. And I'm wondering, first of all, for everybody here, how has your work helped you know yourself? And how are you able to give the subjects of your book their say when, if it is indeed true that really you are so much kind of giving your own story through the work?
Did you mean to say that?
Well, I think it's connected to what I wanted to ask Rohini, actually, and whether she, I don't know how it's not possible to have politics in the book. You are writing about this as an Indian Tamil, about Sri Lanka. But so there's part ethnic identification, but you're writing as an Indian about the Sri Lankan Civil War. which means, at least for me as an Indian, there is first the question of, both distance and proximity. There is both distance and proximity. And you may not necessarily agree with this, but certainly for me as an Indian, there is great Indian state complicity with the Sri Lankan, with the massacre in Sri Lanka. This is ongoing from the 80s. And for me, again, as someone coming from the northeastern part of India, there are complete continuities with these civil wars, with these minorities, and with neoliberalism. There is really no distance between these regimes. But to go back to the question of Sri Lanka, you're writing about Sri Lanka from India. So there's the question of state complicity directly in the arming of the tigers, and then later the Indian government's position has been, it's gone back and forth quite a bit from what I followed. But the other question that I have is that if, as an Indian, one is critiquing Sinhala nationalism, either one does it in the Indian nationalist way and say this is Sinhala Buddhist nationalism and it's bad because it's distinct, or for someone like me, it is very much a parallel to the Hindu nationalism and Indian treatment of minorities and the question of assimilation. So again, this actually directly goes to what you're saying, in that there is a kind of reflection of the Indian self, or do you not feel that way at all about it? I just have a feeling, because you chose the subject, and it's an interesting, because it seems that the book, there are three kinds of Tamil experiences around the book that influence the book: the Indian Tamil, the Sri Lankan Tamil, and the diaspora, which you mentioned, the Western diaspora especially. But what are your thoughts on that?
No, it was totally the beginning of the reason for doing the book. It was almost like and going back there, it was almost like each time I went, and at the same time, that was when the rumbling was happening in India, and then the election happened, and Modi won, and BJP came to government.
Yes.
So this was around the same time, and I constantly felt, am I writing about the right country?
Yes.
Why am I going here when I should be here?
Right.
I did feel that. Thankfully, I had another job in which I could do that when I wanted to.
Yes.
But at every point in Sri Lanka, it was like I was seeing India, if it took the similar path, what would happen. It was like looking into the future almost, in which every time I say that, I hold myself back, because some people hear that as, will we have a militancy? Are the Muslims going to rise up with arms? Sometimes people hear that, and constantly I'm afraid of the words. I can't choose the words I say as much as I can when I write. But when I see that happen in Sri Lanka, when the state becomes more authoritative, the methods it employs,
Right.
and all of that, and then finally I see in the swearing-in ceremony of Modi, one of the first people to arrive was the president of Sri Lanka, and them shaking hands, and many people saying that their personalities are so similar, they would be great friends. And that is not really, I don't know if they are really great friends. It continues to be more geopolitical than personal, of course. At every point, I was thinking of being in Sri Lanka and what I was seeing there as a learning for myself. So maybe in a way, my politics, I don't know if it could be the same. Actually, it would be the same if I reported on similar situations in India, and it has been before, that I question both sides, and I do take sides in some points, but it's important, I felt, that in Sri Lanka, as an outsider, to not fall prey to the kind of the India books that got written from outside, when people outside would come, and I was constantly aware of that, of doing to Sri Lanka things like, they called me, one of the first few conversations I would have with people, they said, oh, you are from the country that betrayed us, you are, and then they would give me these stories in which they felt really abandoned, also then suddenly they had hope, so all of that. So at every point I was questioned, that my outsider status was questioned, not only because I was Indian, but also because I was not from there. In the beginning, I wondered, as people would ask me, oh, are you doing a Sri Lanka book because you are Tamil or you are part Tamil. So I asked myself that question at every point. And it was the Sri Lankans who constantly reminded me that I had nothing in common with them. They would say, well, you haven't gone through this, you are Indian. But I did win some trust because I spoke Tamil. That's the access point of view. But actually, there was very little in common. I was not brought up with the emotions and the nationalisms and the choices that they were living through. So actually, I was reminded, I went feeling less like an outsider, but came back feeling more like one. And it was easier at that point than when I started to write the book to keep myself out of it because of that realization. But I want to ask you, it's similar to what Rachel was saying. For you, when you're writing about your own country, and you also put yourself in the book, and how do you come to those decisions? Or is that a habit or no?
No, I think for me, when you're writing a non-fiction book, I primarily think of myself as a novelist. I think I take some of the rhetoric and poetry, the combination of that in fiction, I take that into the realm of non-fiction. I think I've just begun to have, as I get older, I've begun to have more and more problems with the kind of non-fiction writing that where the narrator is stable and finished while the characters around are kind of unfinished. And this thing may change from book to book, but certainly in the non-fiction book that I wrote, I wanted to show that the narrator is not finished, because that's one of the West-East, for me, there's a kind of, it's very colonial, imperial travel. It's this finished Western person who goes to report. That's the model. And it's very, very well done sometimes. It's beautifully done. There's much that is good about it, but it's not something that I have any empathy for, or any kind of, either ultimately imaginatively or politically. So when I was writing the book, I wanted to show the reader that I am as contingent and as unfinished as the characters I'm writing about, prejudiced. I was quite clear. I didn't want to hide, because again, I think we are both struggling with the idea of objectivity. I think truth and objectivity are different things, right? So, I did want to be truthful. And one of the ways of being truthful was to show that I actually like some of the characters I'm writing about much more than others. But we see that in your book too, that you have this empathy that sort of grows with the characters. And then there are moments where, so I think that's a kind of truthfulness. And I want to show that rather than being some kind of neutral, finished sort of narrator without history, without past, who's just writing about these contingent people. I didn't want to do that in my nonfiction.
I would love to have you, Siddhartha, and everybody here really sort of get precise about terms. Like, what is the difference in your mind between truth and objectivity?
Truth can be very subjective. There can be multiple truths. The objective idea is, it's very often, you see it incredibly in Western journalism. One of the things that I learned when dealing with journalism here, there's much to learn from it. I love the way that magazine editors will always force me to end with a quote. And that's a really interesting choice. You want to end with a quote from a character. And, I had to think about it. It's a learning thing. It's not just rejection. I had to think, no, I would prefer to end with an image. I would prefer to end a piece. And you can do that with ending with an image maybe for like one of the more long-form magazines. But the Times, actually I can't remember what the piece I did for them, how they ended. But there's a preference for ending with a quote. But in the selection of the quote is fascinating. Suppose you're doing a piece on Eric Garner. You choose to end with a policeman's family, or you choose to end, there's a kind of politics out there that can be, you can say we're being objective by placement. We quoted the family earlier, but we're going to end with the quote from the policeman's family. I'm being objective, it's 50%, 50%. There you count the number of quotes. There's 7 quotes from this side, 7 quotes from that side. But we as writers know that placement is also quite crucial. So that's the kind of objectivity that I'm pushing against. And see, I worked in India as a journalist. I worked on the news desks, I worked in newspapers and magazines. I remember having this argument about objectivity. It is very, very simple. When I was on the news desk, a reporter, there was a story about a woman being molested at a nightclub, which is a standard Delhi, journalism thing. And I said, you cannot put in the dress she was wearing. I had the argument. And they said, it's truthful, it's objective. I said, you can't, because that's kind of giving credence to the idea that she was asking for it. And I thought it was truth. But of course, it's a subjective truth, my idea of truth. Because they were right, she was wearing whatever, she was wearing a short dress. But I didn't want it to be flagged in the first paragraph in a case of organization as an editor. I thought it was completely untruthful in a deep-seated way. And I stand by the choice. But objectively speaking, sure, you should put it down. She should put down everything. Maybe she was drunk. So within the larger context of truth in India about gender, so what? That's what my take about it. And I would do the same thing with race relations.
So do you have a reaction to that?
Well, I have several reactions. As people who've been in my class know, I went to the Oxford English Dictionary to look at the genealogy of truth in English and discovered that there is sort of something like subjective truth that's at the core, and it has to do with trothing to someone and being true to someone. It has to do with when you get married, I'll be true to you. And if you cheat on someone, you've been untrue. But I think that the notion of truth that is far more important in nonfiction writing and in serious political journalism is a very archaic injunction that I tell all my students they should follow. And it's very simple because I don't know any culture, East or West, that doesn't have this injunction somewhere in their moral code. It's that thou shalt not make false witness. And to go back to what Rohini has done, I think that she is incredibly scrupulous in hewing to that maxim. And in a legal court of law, you can't have courts of law without the maxim because obviously people will have memories that conflict. Memory is treacherous. So if you want any kind of justice, you have to ask people, as we say sometimes in courts in America, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, which doesn't mean that we all know the truth. It's for the opposite reason that you try to do this. And telling the whole truth is what makes, I think, political reporting at its finest, because it means you don't omit unpleasant facts that are in the case. That's why one of my heroes is George Orwell. In Homage to Catalonia, he goes and he discovers that the Communist Party, which has flown him over there, is busy trying to annihilate the anarchists and Trotskyites in Barcelona. And he said, he describes what he sees. And he comes back to London and all of his old friends hate him for the next 2 or 3 years. He's a traitor to the cause. He's aired dirty laundry of the left. We should have an alliance against fascism. Here you go, going on about a bunch of, rural anarchists. Really, George. So Rohini, there's this texture to the whole way the book is written, and it's in the narrator's voice. It's that there's this sort of overriding sense of deferring to the person who you're trying to give an accounting of, that she becomes the vehicle for this person bearing witness, this person who might otherwise be voiceless. And this is why I think there's a real limit to the idea you just project yourself into other people when you write nonfiction. You can learn a lot about yourself by writing nonfiction, in my view, but it's generally by going outside yourself and becoming completely alienated from everything you think you know and believe. And it's this complete estrangement and disappearance into the other, and then return to the self with the kind of humbling sense of the full pluralism and variety of human experiences. Because if you just go and project yourself onto the people you're writing about, it becomes a kind of echo chamber. That's like really crappy, deadline journalism, it seems to me. And when I wrote a book on Michel Foucault, his world of experience was so remote from my own. So of course there will always be people in the politics of identity in this country right now, they'll say, how could you write about him? You're not gay, you're not into consensual sadomasochism. And I think that's completely misunderstanding what a writer does. It's not about me. It's about trying to understand this other person and get inside their heads and their bones and feel in the flesh what this is all about. And to undertake that act of estrangement, which is an act of the sympathetic imagination. And it's at its most morally fraught, I would say, when the person you're trying to write about is on some level really alien to you. But the best nonfiction writing, to me, it depends on bearing witness to the other, and it's not about me.
I'm interested in your use of the term sympathetic imagination, considering how often the word empathy came up in everything Siddhartha said. What does it mean to empathize when you tell the story of others as a journalist or as writing narrative nonfiction? I mean, we're sitting here with a panel, a fiction writer, a historian, and philosopher, and a journalist, and yet, I think all of your works blend together in a lot of, in a remarkable way. But you all have different perspectives on the role of empathy from the point of view of the author. Can you speak to that a little bit, Rohini?
Yeah. I'm going to start with it, go there, but I'm going to start with something that you said about the objectivity and the he said, she said that we sometimes try to do. For me, when I started out in journalism, when I heard that, I thought, wow, that's a great kind of skill set to have, and just to kind of think, okay, this gives me some structure. Otherwise, people are saying, go out and get this story. So it was important, and it is the kind of, it's not how we understand life, but it worked for journalism. And I think starting at that point where this structure of getting all sides or getting two sides is foisted on me was a good way to begin, because soon I realized that was impossible and that it was not really helping me understand something. And I started critiquing it in myself, but I still continue to do it. I still talk to all the sides. And it's habit, but it's also makes me, and I still think, have I left anyone out? Is someone else out there that I haven't got a perspective from? And as soon as so I'm still actually following the same kind of objectivity rule book that I'm talking to everyone involved, but when I'm doing that, I can't give everyone an equal platform, because that's not how, I have to make the choices at that point to say what I mean, for example, experiences like, like there's protesting going on now, experiences like that are not equal because they don't come from an equal space. So how do you, it is not a 50-50 experience. If you're writing about two people, then that is false to write about it as if it is 50-50 when it is not. And maybe that is where, that kind of awareness, while talking to everybody and soon realizing that there's maybe I'm telling myself, giving myself the power of choosing who I believe and who I don't believe, and at the same time bringing all these perspectives together and trying to go towards objectivity, is when I started actually thinking that I don't have any power in this at all. Like, I really can't, not only can I not change, especially really such a serious political situation, but also that it is in all these different voices that somewhere there is an understanding that we can get. That understanding is all I can try to achieve or try to kind of highlight. And by constantly being conscious of the fact that I did not have answers, that I will not be fully ever be able to understand this, I haven't talked to everyone, this is not all that is there out there, maybe that was the way I tackled empathy. Because constantly being conscious of the fact that I can never put myself in this person's shoe, because that's really, I can try, and trying is important, but giving them the power over their narrative and for them to say fully what they want to say in the most complex way, and then change their mind tomorrow if they want to. This is not a court. I am not a court of law. But even the court of law makes room sometimes for that, if you can show why you changed your mind. Only pressure is not allowed, right? So if I can give them the power, then in some way I have tried to reduce myself. It's an attempt. I might not always be able to reduce myself. and then, like Siddharth said, to put myself in there and show that I'm also I'm not finished and I'm not complete and I'm as confused and complicated and perhaps more than the people I'm writing about is one way to do it. And, it's interesting because that's the same kind of thought that led me to not put myself, so to give credence to and to kind of contradict that other voice that usually people use, in which they say, I care about these people, look at all the cool things I did, in which I went and talked to all these people, and I fought the army and all of that. To contradict that kind of Western way of telling a story, I actually put myself out of it, which I think Siddharth puts himself in there to contradict it by doing it a different way. It's really interesting.
You use the word empathy on page 173 in the book in the most interesting context. And it is a character, this is an important character, who remarks of the plight of the Tamils, quote, "I know now how the Muslims must have felt when the Tigers forced them out of the north." And you go on, and this is a friend of Mughal, and you say that Mughal had wondered how Sanjeevan, the character, was able to acknowledge the suffering of the smaller minority group at the hands of his leaders when his own community was wrapped up in its victimhood. How had he held onto that unselfish thought? Those are your words. It's a great phrase, unselfish thought. How did he preserve his empathy? You actually give a definition of empathy as unselfish thought. I thought it was really beautiful.
Anything to say about it, Siddhartha?
Should we open it
Yeah, I think we can open it up. I mean, I guess I want to, I mean, like, it's not a question, but it's sort of, to, in the way that Siddhartha might end an article, I'll end this panel moderation with an image, which is of an objective, what I believe to be a clearly objective footage of a man being murdered, and how that has somehow, through our systems of narrative, and our systems of our justice system, and how that transforms narrative has resulted in not even putting the murderer on trial. So that's an image in my mind, and I don't know what to ask about it, but I said it to the crowd. If any of you have anything to ask or say about it, or to the panel.
I guess this is going back to the question, and connected to what Rachel was saying, but also to the discussion of truth and objectivity. I mean, it's been amazing listening to all these different reflections on what it is to write about other people's lives, but I think we've gotten a pretty favorable conception of that project from different perspectives, different endorsements of that. And just a question that I'd be interested in hearing the panelists' perspective on. I wonder, again, and this is tied to this, what truths we're allowed to access through different modes of writing, whether the commitment to describing or analyzing a problem through individual experiences, as opposed to, say, and this is too crude caricature, but larger structural transformations or any of the other scales you could use to consider those problems, even if inevitably, when you're discussing an individual experience, you're leading up sometimes and going back down at others, but still, whether prioritizing the individual inevitably commits you to a kind of politics and a kind of truth, which is rich in its own way, but by its nature, like any formal choice, won't necessarily rule out others. I just wonder, every writer confronts this obviously in their own work, and if you guys could talk about how you've grappled with that in your own experience. I struggle with them a lot, so selfishly, very selfish truth, I guess.
No, I think it's a very, very valid point, this relationship between individual and structure, and that if you're choosing individuals, there's a kind of politics to that you want to, that's often, sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes it's unselfconscious.
And often a very conservative politics.
Absolutely,
as well.
absolutely. But for me, I mean, when I choose to write about individuals, it's also partly the kind of individuals you choose. They're often individuals. There's a choice to the kind of individuals you're writing about. you will see history or structures being brushed against certain characters, certain kinds of characters, much more than with others. I mean, you will see it physically, and in fiction writers, you will see it physically, you will see it in mental transformation, so that you can, I think there is a relationship with individuals and structures. But the other thing is that I think also, maybe I don't understand individual in the same way as, for instance, many of my students. I mean, I don't necessarily see an individual as this lone being formed by high school, deep psychology, childhood. We talk about this all the time, that individuals, for me, an individual is really at the intersection. An individual is not an individual until that individual is meeting, rubbing against other things, persons, structures. It's precisely at the intersection that an individual exists. It's not this sort of sealed off thing for me. So that's partly the way I understand individuals, and I think that's what attracts me to them, precisely because you can see them, how they transform structures, are transformed by them. It's the intersections that I'm really interested in. I mean, I'm not really terribly interested in the self or the other as watertight categories. I'm interested in what happens when the two meet, when the two collide, often again and again and again. Because that's what I find interesting as a writer.
The structure is something, and so because it's an interesting question, because the things that I struggle with most in this book and also in any article that I write is the context. That to write that, I have to read much more than I will even be able to include, right? And that I think that itself you kind of choose in the end when you when you're reading around that subject, you're trying to show something as if you're trying to capture some view, something, and you're reading around it, you're reading also individuals, you're reading things about it, and somewhere that filters down to your understanding of it. And that's okay. I don't know if it has to be definitive all the time. The aim for it to be definitive and for the choices to be the final and not part of a larger whole of many people, different people talking and coming to it in different ways. I mean, so very specifically for this book, the question I've often been asked is that by writing about, especially by people who might not feel that much sympathy for the victims of this war, or feel that a part of it is deserved, have asked me why I did not write about the community that was terrorized by the Tamil Tigers. And that is when I thought about it, and that's when I realized that the choice I made, I retrospectively understood that there is a lot of work. One is the choice to write about people who have not usually been written about very much. The other is, and that I could have done as individuals, or I could have done as structure. I would have approached it maybe in the same way. This is just final choices that I made. But if I had written, and I did try to write about the other side, I guess, and for other access reasons, I didn't finally put them in there. But I realized that if I had written about everyone equally, each of those, if it was individuals that I was trying to use to say all the sides, each would bear the responsibility to represent their community, and that's really dangerous and not true, not at all true. So that is why, and then I decided, okay, maybe if I write about this group of people or this community or this one side, I can complexify this little thing, Let me just give this a bigger and deeper and, I don't know, grayer shade, give it that much, instead of doing a dilution of like 5 things and try to get at them, so I was not going for definitive at all, but more the opposite.
In the background of your question, I think, is a debate that historians had about 40 years ago, and it came from the direction of Marxism and the true understanding of social conditions involved in objective analysis of structures. And that understanding of history came into collision with a rebirth of narrative history at the same time. I bridle at the idea of telling stories from a personal point of view that it has a politics. I don't think that's true. There have been stories about individuals going back to Homer. I think actually it's a choice about what you're doing. Are you trying to do social science, or are you a storyteller? Rohini Mohan is an amazing storyteller, and that's what she set out to do. And she chose stories to tell. You can't tell all the stories. I mean, she's telling stories of people that normally we wouldn't read about, people who are anonymous, essentially. When I wrote Democracy is in the Streets, the most interesting story I told was of a woman named Sharon Jeffrey who was not well known, unlike Tom Hayden, and what her experiences had been as a woman in a movement that was unconsciously patriarchal through much of its ostensibly radical early history. But the imperative, once you've decided you're telling a story, there are certain things now you need to do, I think. That's, there's social science and there's storytelling, and they both have their place.
One last question. I just have a question of Rohini, which is a little bit different, but so I'm working on some fiction at the moment, and it's, I'm Chinese descent, and it's revolved around Tibetans, and I've just come back from India, and I guess I had very similar questions asked of me as what it sounded like you had when you were in Sri Lanka, and I was wondering how successful you feel you were in being able to be that outside eye, but then also be amongst this people in a not colonialist way, but
Okay,
a colonialist way, and also what you feel your ongoing responsibility is towards the Sri Lankans after you've written this book.
The straddling of being an outsider and still getting access as if you were an insider, I think comes from showing yourself. I don't know, for me, I started realizing those who accepted me were people that I had asked very stupid questions to. I really asked them like anything. And also because once they started realizing that I didn't know everything that they expected me to know, they explained more. And also that explanation comes, different people would explain in different ways, give you their propaganda, sometimes explain things with their own personal perspective. It just actually throws up much more than my question as an interviewer would have found responses. So I do think that I try to be true to myself, that I was not pretending to know the things that I would not, as I have done before as a journalist, nod when I didn't know what they were saying. I would leave it, put it somewhere, and then ask them a question later, or if they would, I'm telling you very practical things, right? So I didn't, and then they would come to it later, they would answer it maybe. And there were times when people did for access, that kind of, in places where you're not allowed to go and that kind of thing, where people asked me to dress up differently or to say something else about who I am, why I'm there. And practically that gets you into much more trouble than if you are fully honest about who you are and why you're there. Honest to people who you need to be honest to, not people who can throw you out of there. I'll admit that. So I was not honest to a lot, fully honest. I just gave them enough information to the authorities so that I could go where I could go. I didn't tell them everything. They don't need to know that I think they're dictators. I tell them later. They'll know now. Yeah, so I think that is part of straddling the outsider thing, to be actually very conscious of it, and therefore also that I think helps in the narrative also. It did help me to feel more unsure about what I believed, and not write a Sri Lanka book, as I said earlier, like as people have, that irritates me that when people write about India as the India book, that India is this, and then like 5 years later you have someone saying India is this. So it bugs me, and I try not to do that, and that is the imperialist, colonialist kind of lens that I was conscious of and I was trying to avoid. I did sometimes think that, for example, when I would ask people, or when they explain themselves they didn't have anything, the poor people that I spoke to, and then they would say that, yes, I have a house in this place and land, and I want to get there. And immediately my reaction as an Indian who has, and also someone who has reported on poverty in India was, you have a house, you have land, and you're still poor. So then I understood the cultural background of how most people do own land, but they're still in that structure, they are still poor and most underprivileged. It's different. So it was small things that because I was conscious of being an outsider and coming to it that way, and still, not saying that, so now you're not poor. I can't say that anymore. So I'm just giving a very small, specific example. As for a sense of responsibility, I do feel a strong sense of responsibility. It is why I decided to write a book. It was supposed to be initially just articles, but I didn't understand enough to actually write an article, I thought, and felt more confused, and the notes were growing. And then there were people like Mugil. Sorry, I'm about to say a real name. So some people like Mugil started asking me why, and they forgot after a point because I was just turning up and we were hanging out almost. She forgot that I was going to write a book, but she still constantly, it was like somebody visiting from outside, and she would just tell me the update and then kind of bitch about whoever else in the family, some of which I have included, which is, I thought, important, the kind of friction in the family and all of that, which is not entirely personal. So it was important that for her, sometimes she saw that she didn't put responsibility on me. It freed me. But after some time, these people started asking me what is happening. Like, will you please tell these stories? Will you do something? So I think they assumed that that the stories would have more power than I think in terms of changing their lives. I don't. Unfortunately, it's a limitation that one story or one book is not going to change their life. But maybe someone somewhere will read it at the right time, and it will help when they make policy or when they try to go to Sri Lanka to think about it. So that kind of sense of responsibility is what makes me talk about the book after it's been published in different places, to talk about these people who live there, to talk about the things that I saw, which don't usually come out very much, or I can at least add to that, even if it is coming out. So I talk about it, even though I would rather write and not speak. But I talk about it because it needs to be still out there, and when people are asking questions, that means they're interested, and all I can do is just have some more people be interested, and therefore I think they will. I believe that most people will care, and interest soon goes somewhere to caring in some way. So just to talk about it, and to them, it's not a specific responsibility that I'll change your life, and I don't think I have the ability to change their life, but to just put their stories out there so more people know. And some of this is documentation for me. The things that you said that, we don't know the source. On my computer, everything has footnotes.
The NSA probably has it already.
I want to thank the Center for Fiction for hosting and for everyone for coming. And I want to conclude with just the thought that I opened by saying that this book has no business existing. And I mean, Jim and I teach a course in publishing, contemporary publishing, and this is the kind of book that, just like truth doesn't have clear category, black or white, I would say that, by virtue of you being such a compelling storyteller that, coming to the book and not having any knowledge or interest in or about Sri Lanka, coming out of it, it has been a political revelation for me, to be so in the minds and experiences and so deeply, such a deeply felt narrative experience to go through. So in I guess there's the nuance and in the gray areas, it's managed to be a more effectively political book than I think a lot of other books that you would read about Sri Lanka. And I'd also say that everyone here should go against the grain and buy a copy from the Center for Fiction and have Rohini sign it, because she's going to be a star. Thank you all.